Her family called her useless, a burden. Then, in the midst of her isolation, the Duke of Ravensdale, known for his cold indifference, made an unexpected move. He chose her, the daughter of a fallen family, as his bride. But why did he pick the woman everyone else had rejected? And what does this mean for her future? Find out now, but trust me, this shocking twist will leave you questioning everything. Welcome back, my wonderful family and friends. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit subscribe and drop a comment, letting me know where you're tuning in from. And trust me, you won't want to miss tomorrow's story, so stay tuned. Ophelia Green stood by the window, gazing out at the glittering lights of London's skyline. A chill evening breeze swept through the curtains, but it couldn't cool the fire of humiliation that burned deep in her chest. The world outside was full of promise and laughter, but within the confines of her family's modest home, it felt as though she were imprisoned by the weight of her own worthlessness. Ophelia was the daughter of a once prominent family, now reduced to the lowest rung of society's ladder. The vast estate that had once belonged to her family was gone, consumed by her father's reckless gambling and foolish investments. The fortune they had built over generations had been squandered, leaving her family with little more than debts, regrets, and a reputation that was quickly slipping into obscurity. Her father, once a man of influence, had retreated into himself, more a ghost than a father. He lived far away in a small, crumbling parish, his own dignity lost along with their wealth. At 24, Ophelia had already reached the age when most women of her class had already secured their futures, either through marriage or through the expectation of a family fortune. But Ophelia had neither, no dowry, no connections, and no family name to offer. In the eyes of society, she was nothing but a burden, a useless daughter. Her family's harsh treatment of her was nothing short of cruel. Her mother, once a lady of grace and beauty, had long since lost all warmth and affection for Ophelia. The scorn in her mother's voice when she spoke of Ophelia's unmarried state was a constant reminder that Ophelia had failed to fulfill her purpose in life. "Why can't you be more like your sisters?" her mother would often say, her eyes cold and calculating. "They knew how to make the right connections. You, Ophelia, are nothing but a failure, clinging to books and fantasies." Ophelia had learned long ago to bear these remarks with grace, but each word felt like a dagger, slowly eroding the small pieces of her dignity. In her mother's eyes, she was not just an unmarried daughter, but a woman who had no use in the world. Her relatives, too, had made their judgment known. They viewed her as a disappointment, an embarrassment to the family. They had no patience for someone who failed to secure a marriageable match. Every glance, every word spoken behind her back, was another reminder that she was not worthy of anything but pity. Yet, despite the harshness of her family's treatment, Ophelia carried herself with quiet dignity. She didn't possess the wealth or the title that could make her desirable to society, but she had something far more valuable, her intelligence. She had developed a deep love for literature and the arts, something that had been instilled in her by her late mother, whose own education had been the last vestige of their former lives. In the solace of books, Ophelia found refuge from the world that saw her as nothing more than a failure. But as much as her books soothed her soul, they could not change the fact that society had no use for her kind of wealth. One evening, as the latest ball of the season approached, Ophelia was preparing herself for another night of isolation. Lady Greystone had kindly invited her to the charity event, though Ophelia suspected it was a mere act of charity on Lady Greystone's part. She had no illusions about her status among the upper crust of society. She knew exactly what would happen. She would stand in the corner, a wallflower, unnoticed by most, ridiculed by a few, and forgotten by the end of the night. She stood before the mirror, adjusting the simple gown made from her late mother's old dress. The fabric was faded and worn, but Ophelia had worked hard to refashion it into something more suitable for the occasion. It was a small act of rebellion against the life that had been thrust upon her. She would dress with dignity, even if she had nothing else to offer. As she looked at her reflection, she saw the face of a woman who had long ago accepted that her future would never be as bright as she had once imagined. Her features were too refined for someone so thoroughly dismissed by society. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant knot, but her eyes, large and soft, betrayed the sadness she carried inside. The world had no place for a woman like her. The ball was being held at Lady Asprey's residence, an imposing mansion in the heart of Mayfair. The gilded chandeliers, marble floors, and echoing laughter that filled the halls were a sharp contrast to Ophelia's quiet existence. She could already hear the orchestra playing in the distance, their music rising and falling in gentle waves as guests arrived. But Ophelia, standing on the fringes of the gathering, would be little more than a spectator. When Ophelia arrived at the ball, she was greeted with the expected politeness, though she could feel the disapproval in the air, thick as smoke. Lady Greystone, ever the gracious hostess, smiled warmly, but Ophelia could tell that her kindness was a mere formality. As she moved through the grand ballroom, she became painfully aware of the whispers around her. "She's come again," Lady Pembroke whispered to her circle of admirers, her voice carrying just loud enough for Ophelia to hear. "The poor thing, trying to make her way in this world without a dowry. What can she possibly offer?" Ophelia's heart sank, but she forced herself to keep her chin lifted, to appear dignified even as every inch of her burned with humiliation. She had heard these cruel remarks before, and though they still stung, she had learned to endure them. It was, after all, the only thing she could do. As the night wore on, Ophelia found herself standing in the corner of the ballroom, clutching her fan tightly, trying to remain invisible. She had no interest in the music, the dances, or the endless chatter of society. She had learned that the less attention she drew to herself, the better. But it was then, as the light flickered across the room, that she felt it an intense gaze upon her. She turned slightly, catching the eyes of a man standing across the room, his figure tall and imposing. He was watching her with a look that seemed to pierce through the crowd, and for a moment it felt as though the world had stilled. Alexander Fitzhugh, the Duke of Ravensdale, was a man who rarely participated in the frivolities of high society. He stood apart as always, observing the guests with an air of indifference. Wealth radiated from him like a tangible presence, his attire immaculate, his dark eyes unreadable. But there was something about him, something that made Ophelia's heart beat a little faster, though she could not explain why. The Duke of Ravensdale had always been a figure of mystery to her, a solitary man, rarely seen in public, and when he was usually surrounded by whispers of his coldness and aloofness. But tonight, his gaze was fixed on her, and for a brief moment, she wondered if he saw through the layers of her disguise, if he could see the woman who had been cast aside by everyone, even her own family. Before she could turn away, the Duke began to move toward her. The music seemed to quiet in her ears, the voices of the crowd fading into a distant hum. Ophelia's heart raced, and she felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon her. Was he truly coming toward her? The Duke approached, and for a moment, Ophelia was certain he would pass her by. But instead, he stopped just in front of her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Miss Green," he said, his voice low but clear, "may I have the honor of this dance?" The invitation was simple, but its impact was anything but. Society watched in stunned silence as the Duke of Ravensdale, the most sought-after bachelor in London, asked a woman without a dowry to dance a woman whom society deemed useless. Ophelia, her heart pounding in her chest, looked up at him. For a brief moment, she considered refusing. But something in his eyes, something that spoke of genuine interest, rather than pity, compelled her to nod, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it in his. And in that moment, Ophelia Green knew that her life was about to change forever. The orchestra's strains filled the air as Ophelia Green stood by the edge of the ballroom, trying her best to remain unnoticed. The laughter of the fashionable elite echoed around her, a sound that felt alien and distant to her ears. She had never been part of this world, the world of wealth, beauty, and social status, and tonight she knew that nothing would change. She was merely an observer, a shadow in the grand halls of Lady Asprey's estate. Ophelia's thoughts drifted back to the night's earlier moments. She had entered the ballroom with the utmost grace, wearing her late mother's gown, but no amount of refinement could hide the poverty that clung to her. She had quickly retreated to the corner, where she hoped to escape the judging eyes of the aristocracy. After all, she knew her place in this world unwanted, unimportant, and, as her family constantly reminded her, useless. The night wore on, but nothing changed. Women with towering coiffures, elaborate gowns, and glistening jewels passed by her, wrapped in their own conversations. The men, for the most part, glanced past her as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture. There were no whispers of admiration for Ophelia, no flirtatious glances, just the cold, indifferent air of exclusion. Yet there was something different about tonight. Ophelia could feel it in the way people moved around her, in the way the room seemed to hum with a quiet energy. She wasn't sure why, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel entirely invisible. Perhaps it was the way the grand chandeliers caught the light, or maybe it was the fact that she was standing here, within the very heart of this world she had never belonged to. Whatever it was, it made her stomach twist in ways she didn't quite understand. Her reverie was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. Ophelia turned her head, surprised to find herself looking directly into the cold, dark eyes of Alexander Fitzhugh, the Duke of Ravensdale. His tall figure moved through the crowd with an elegance and quiet authority that seemed to part the sea of people before him. He was everything Ophelia had always believed men of his station to be: distant, aloof, and indifferent to the struggles of those outside his world. But tonight, his gaze was fixed upon her, and it felt different than the usual dismissive glances she received from other men. His eyes held something: curiosity, perhaps, or perhaps a deeper understanding that Ophelia couldn't quite place. She instinctively straightened, her fingers gripping the edges of her fan as she tried to steady her pulse. She was no stranger to the Duke's reputation. He was known as a solitary figure, rarely seen at these kinds of events unless duty demanded it. He did not seek the company of women for anything beyond social obligations. Yet here he was, approaching her, and for a moment, Ophelia wondered if he had mistaken her for someone else. To her shock, the Duke stopped directly in front of her, his gaze unwavering. "Miss Green," he said, his voice low and measured, "may I have the honor of this dance?" Ophelia's breath caught in her throat, her heart leaping in her chest. The Duke of Ravensdale, the wealthiest and most influential man in the room, was offering her a dance. It was a gesture so out of the ordinary that it left her momentarily speechless. Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Should she refuse? Should she accept? Surely this was a mistake, a social faux pas on his part. He must have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But his gaze remained steady, his posture regal, as though his invitation was both sincere and unspokenly authoritative. I, Ophelia stammered, unsure of what to say. The Duke, ever composed, offered a faint smile. "It seems you've caught my interest, Miss Green. Please, do not make me regret asking." The invitation hung in the air, and before Ophelia could find a way to respond, the music shifted, the waltz beginning in earnest. Ophelia hesitated. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, reminding her that she was nothing more than a burden, a useless daughter. She had no fortune, no family connections. She had never been taught to dance with the grace of an aristocrat, but the Duke's eyes were warm with something else now, an invitation, not just to dance, but to be seen. And so, in that moment, despite every ounce of doubt and fear that gnawed at her, Ophelia placed her hand in his. The Duke's grip was firm but gentle as he led her to the center of the ballroom. The world seemed to fall away, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Ophelia felt as though she were floating. As they began to dance, her steps were tentative, uncertain, but his presence was steadying. His movements were practiced, and he guided her with a deftness that made her forget the whispers that always trailed her. As the waltz unfolded, Ophelia's nerves began to settle. She found herself focusing not on the judgment of the onlookers, but on the Duke himself. His eyes, though cold and distant to the rest of the room, seemed softer now, as if the weight of the world had been momentarily lifted from his shoulders. His demeanor was one of quiet strength, but there was an undeniable loneliness in his gaze. She wondered briefly what drove a man like him to isolate himself so completely from the world around him. Their conversation flowed as naturally as the dance itself. Ophelia spoke of her love for books, literature, and the quiet life she had always known. The Duke listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that surprised her. He spoke little of his wealth or power, instead steering the conversation toward more meaningful topics: philosophy, poetry, and the things that made Ophelia's heart race. For the first time that evening, Ophelia found herself lost in the dance, not just physically but mentally and emotionally. She spoke freely, without the burden of expectations, and the Duke responded with a warmth that sent a shiver down her spine. There was no pretense in his words, no judgment in his eyes. He seemed to see her as more than just a daughter without a dowry, more than just the useless woman her family had made her feel. But even as the connection between them deepened, Ophelia couldn't escape the voice of doubt that lingered at the back of her mind. Was this truly happening? Did the Duke see her as someone worth knowing, or was this simply a moment of idle curiosity for a man used to choosing from a selection of high-born ladies? The more she allowed herself to be swept away by the rhythm of the dance, the more she feared the truth of her own worth, or lack thereof. As the music came to an end, the Duke's hand lingered at her waist for a fraction longer than necessary. Ophelia's heart raced, and for a moment she found herself staring up at him, caught between the comfort of his presence and the fear that this was all just a fleeting moment in time. "You dance well," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge of something unspoken. Ophelia managed a small smile, trying to steady her breath. "I have not danced in years," she confessed, her cheeks flushed with a combination of embarrassment and something else, something she dared not name. "You hide your skill well," he replied, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though weighing her every word. "There's more to you than meets the eye, Miss Green." Ophelia's heart skipped a beat. His words, simple as they were, struck her deeply. It was the first time anyone had ever acknowledged her worth beyond the confines of her family's expectations. He had seen through the veil of her poverty, her lack of title, her absence of dowry. Before she could respond, a ripple of whispers swept through the ballroom. Ophelia's eyes flickered nervously toward the crowd. Her family's eyes were sharp with judgment, her relatives exchanging knowing glances. She could feel the weight of their disapproval bearing down on her, as though the world itself had shifted in their eyes. The Duke of Ravensdale, dancing with the likes of Miss Green, Lady Octavia Pembroke's voice rang out, too loud, too pointed. What a strange sight. Her words cut through the air, sending a chill down Ophelia's spine. She had no illusions about the cruelty of high society. She knew the whispers that would follow, the judgment that would stain her reputation forever. But to Ophelia's surprise, the Duke did not flinch. His gaze, though cold, remained unwavering. He stepped back slightly, his hand falling gently from her waist. "Let them talk," he said, his voice low and calm, but with a note of defiance. "I've heard worse." Ophelia stood motionless, unsure of how to respond. The room seemed to close in on her once more, the weight of societal expectations and judgment suffocating her. But then, as if in a final silent act of rebellion, the Duke smiled at her briefly, but it was enough to make her heart flutter. And in that moment, Ophelia knew that the whispers would not define her not anymore. The days following Ophelia's dance with the Duke of Ravensdale were a blur of whispers and furtive glances. At first, she had hoped that the rumors surrounding her would die down, that society's gossip would be but a passing wave, easily forgotten in the next whirlwind of scandal. But she had underestimated the cruelty of high society and the viciousness with which the powerful would attack those they deemed vulnerable. It began with a letter. Ophelia first heard of it through a quiet conversation between two women at the local market. The words, snippets of their hushed tones, drifted toward her, sharp as daggers. "Did you hear? She's been writing to the Duke, seducing him, no less," one woman whispered, her voice laced with mockery. "All that talk of literature and charm, but it's obvious what she's after. His wealth, his title." Ophelia's breath caught in her throat. She knew the rumors would spread, but she had not anticipated this, an accusation so vile, so deliberate in its cruelty. The letter, it seemed, had been written in Ophelia's own hand, an alleged confession of her scheming intentions to trap the Duke into marriage for his fortune. The letter was carefully crafted, so convincingly written that even the most skeptical among the ton would believe it. The elegant script, the flowery language, everything about it felt authentic, as though it could have easily come from Ophelia herself. But Ophelia knew the truth. She had never written such a thing. She had never, for a moment, considered manipulating the Duke for his wealth. The mere thought was abhorrent to her. But the evidence was damning. The letter spread quickly, finding its way into the hands of the most influential members of London society. It was circulated in whispers at tea parties, read aloud in drawing rooms, and dissected with malicious delight by those who were eager to tear her down. Ophelia, once invisible to most, was now the subject of every conversation. Her name, once associated with nothing more than polite indifference, was now synonymous with scandal. The next few days were a blur of increasing isolation. When Ophelia walked into town, the streets seemed to empty before her. Women turned away, their eyes flickering with judgment, while the men glanced at her with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. It was as though the very air had shifted what had once been a quiet but tolerable existence had turned into an unbearable prison of whispers. And then there was her family. Her mother, ever the symbol of cold disapproval, was the first to express her disdain for Ophelia's perceived actions. She had once been the one to drill into Ophelia that her worth was tied to her ability to marry well, but now that she had failed even in this, her mother's disappointment seemed unbearable. "You've shamed us all," her mother had said, her voice sharp as she looked Ophelia over with a mixture of sorrow and disgust. "How could you do this? The letter, everyone has seen it. The Duke is a man of high rank. He is the one we all dream of marrying into. And you have tarnished everything." Ophelia felt as though she had been struck. Her mother's words pierced her like cold steel, every syllable further chipping away at what little self-worth she had managed to cling to. The one person who should have stood by her had turned against her. "What were you thinking, Ophelia?" her mother continued, her eyes narrowing with anger. "This will ruin you. It will ruin us. You've always been a burden, but now you've gone too far." Ophelia stood silent, her heart heavy with the weight of her mother's scorn. The shame that had already begun to settle over her now felt like a suffocating blanket. She had always known that she would never live up to her family's expectations, but now, in the face of these false accusations, she felt utterly powerless. Her father, who had been absent for so long, had written her a terse letter. It was cold and distant, filled with the kind of disappointment that only a parent could wield with such skill. He made no attempt to comfort her, offering no support. Instead, he reminded her of the family's disgrace and her failure to secure a future. Ophelia's reputation, once fragile, now lay in tatters. The weight of the world seemed to settle on her shoulders, and she felt every ounce of it. She had never wanted wealth or status. She had never sought a marriage for its financial security. But now, the world saw her as a schemer, a woman who had tried to trap a man of wealth for her own gain. And worse, her own family had abandoned her. As the scandal deepened, Ophelia found herself alone in her room, her thoughts a swirling mess of confusion and despair. She had never been one for drama, never sought the attention of the ton. She had simply wanted to exist in the shadows, unnoticed, untouched by society's cruelty. But now, she was at the center of the storm. Through it all, one question gnawed at her: where was the Duke of Ravensdale in all of this? She had not heard from him since their dance. The brief exchange they shared that night had seemed so genuine, so filled with understanding. But now, she couldn't help but wonder if his silence meant he was distancing himself from her. Perhaps he was just as embarrassed by the rumors as everyone else. After all, what man of his station would want to be involved with a woman so thoroughly tainted by scandal? Ophelia's heart sank as she considered the possibility. The Duke was a man of great influence and wealth, the very epitome of what society held dear. He was not some lonely recluse who would seek solace in the company of a woman without dowry or title. He had made no public defense of her, no word to counter the accusations that had destroyed her name. Was he ashamed of her? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She blinked, startled by the sudden interruption. Her heart quickened as she hesitated before walking over to the door. Was it her mother again, coming to deliver another scathing reprimand? But when she opened the door, it was not her mother standing there. To her surprise, it was none other than the Duke of Ravensdale. He stood there, his tall figure framed by the doorway, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Ophelia stood frozen, unsure of what to say. The Duke's appearance in her modest home was so unexpected, so out of place, that it left her speechless. "Miss Green," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I've come to speak with you." Ophelia's heart leapt in her chest. She had never expected him to seek her out, not after the scandal had broken. She had feared that he would retreat into his world of wealth and privilege, leaving her behind to bear the full weight of the rumors. What do you wish to speak of?" Ophelia asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. The Duke stepped into the room, his presence commanding but gentle. His eyes were dark, and there was a flicker of something unreadable in them. "I wish to set the record straight," he said simply. "The letter that has been circulating," he paused, his jaw tightening, "is a forgery. I know this." Ophelia's breath caught in her throat. For the first time since the scandal had erupted, she felt a glimmer of hope. The Duke believed her. "You believe me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I do," he replied, his gaze steady. and I will not let these lies tarnish your reputation further." Ophelia's heart swelled with a mix of relief and confusion. He was standing in her home, offering her his support, but at what cost? She could feel the weight of society's gaze pressing down on him too. His reputation was just as fragile as hers, and by publicly defending her, he was risking his own standing. "But what of you?" she asked, her voice shaking. "The Tun will never forgive you. The scandal will follow you wherever you go." The Duke's expression softened, and he stepped closer to her, his voice low. "I care not for the opinion of those who would tear us down based on lies." Ophelia's breath caught in her throat as she met his gaze. In that moment, she realized that the Duke of Ravensdale was not simply offering her his defense, he was offering her something more. He was offering her a chance at something real. But even as his words gave her hope, Ophelia knew that the battle was far from over. The Duke had pledged his support, but the question still lingered: would it be enough to silence the whispers? Could their connection survive the scorn of society? And more pressing, could Ophelia truly let herself believe that someone like the Duke, a man of such stature, could see her for who she truly was, not a burden, not a disgrace, but someone worthy of love and respect? As the Duke stood before her, Ophelia could not help but feel a flicker of something deep within her heart, a hope that perhaps, despite all the lies, she was not as useless as her family had always claimed. The days following the scandal were a whirlwind of confusion and despair for Ophelia. She had heard the whispers, felt the weight of society's judgment, and even her own family's condemnation. But there had been one constant, one flicker of hope amidst the storm: Alexander Fitzhugh, the Duke of Ravensdale. Ophelia had never expected the Duke to take any action on her behalf. After all, he was a man of immense power and status, and she was just the daughter of a fallen clergyman with no wealth or connections to offer. In her most desperate moments, she had wondered if his initial interest in her had simply been a fleeting distraction, a brief indulgence for a lonely man in a crowded room. Yet, after his visit to her home and his promise to uncover the truth, Ophelia found herself clinging to a thread of hope that she could not shake. The Duke was no stranger to the way society worked. He knew how quickly rumors could ruin someone's reputation, how one forged letter could destroy a life. So, rather than retreating into silence or leaving Ophelia to fend for herself, Alexander decided to take matters into his own hands. He began his investigation quietly. The Duke's wealth and influence allowed him to move through the streets of London undetected, using his connections to gather information about the origins of the forged letter. It was a dangerous game, but the Duke was determined. He knew the stakes were high if the scandal was allowed to continue. Ophelia's reputation would be destroyed beyond repair. Worse still, it could ruin her for good. The breakthrough came when Alexander's trusted steward, Mr. Rowe, uncovered a subtle but telling detail. The letter that had been circulated as Ophelia's confession had a watermark, one that was exclusive to a particular stationer in London. The same stationer who had supplied paper to none other than Lady Octavia Pembroke. A damning connection, to say the least. With this new information in hand, the Duke turned to the handwriting itself. It had been forged with remarkable skill, but there were certain flourishes, slightly irregular loops and strokes that made it unmistakably different from Ophelia's own writing. The subtle discrepancies spoke volumes to those who knew what to look for. The evidence pointed to one person with crystal clarity: Lady Octavia Pembroke, the malicious socialite who had made no secret of her disdain for Ophelia. It wasn't just the letter. Lady Octavia had been known to plot and scheme behind the scenes, always maneuvering for her daughter, Genevieve, to secure the Duke's favor. This was the most likely motive behind the forgery. Ophelia, a penniless woman with no dowry, was an obstacle to Genevieve's ambitions. With the evidence mounting, the Duke made his decision. Rather than silently acquiescing to the rumors, he would confront them head-on. He would expose the truth. He would defend Ophelia. The grand ball hosted by Lady Asprey was the venue chosen for the public confrontation. It was the perfect place where the highest echelons of society would gather, and where any scandal would ripple through the fabric of London's elite. The ball would be the stage on which the Duke of Ravensdale would unveil the truth, and Ophelia's fate would be decided in front of all of London's most important figures. Ophelia had no idea what to expect when she entered the ballroom that night. She had already endured so much, so many whispers, so much humiliation, but she had never imagined that the Duke would take such a public stand on her behalf. When she arrived, her heart heavy with anxiety, she caught sight of him across the room, his dark eyes scanning the crowd. He was already deep in conversation with a few of the city's most powerful men, but when their eyes met, something passed between them, a silent understanding. The night seemed to drag on, but Ophelia's focus was solely on the Duke. His presence loomed over her like a comforting shadow, and yet she could not shake the feeling that whatever was about to happen would change everything. Finally, as the evening reached its crescendo, Alexander stepped forward. The music faltered slightly, the orchestra's notes quieter, almost as if anticipating the moment. The crowd fell into a stunned silence as the Duke raised his hand, commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rang out clearly across the room, "I must address the rumors that have been circulating regarding Miss Ophelia Green." The room tensed. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward him. Ophelia's heart raced as she tried to steady her breath. She could already feel the stares, the judgment of those who had already written her off. The whispers began again, louder now, but Alexander pressed on. "The letter that has been circulating, accusing Miss Green of pursuing me for my fortune, is a lie. It has been forged." His words struck like a hammer, shattering the tension that had gripped the room. Ophelia felt a rush of relief and disbelief flood through her. The truth was finally being revealed, but the weight of Alexander's words was only just beginning to sink in. The Duke, standing tall and resolute, had chosen to fight for her, to expose the injustice of the scandal. "I have conducted a thorough investigation," he continued, his voice unwavering. "The letter's watermark belongs to a stationer known to supply Lady Octavia Pembroke. The handwriting, as expert as it may have been, does not belong to Miss Green. It belongs to those who sought to tarnish her reputation for their own selfish purposes." There was a collective gasp from the crowd as the Duke laid out the evidence before them. He spoke calmly but with an undeniable conviction, making it clear that this was not a matter of hearsay or rumor, it was fact. He had the proof. "Lady Octavia Pembroke," he declared, turning to the woman in question, who had gone pale under the Duke's sharp gaze. "I believe you owe Miss Ophelia Green an apology. The malicious lies you have spread about her are not just damaging to her character, they are an affront to the very idea of decency." The tension in the room was palpable. Lady Octavia, though clearly shaken, straightened and opened her mouth to speak, but the Duke silenced her with a raised hand. "Enough," he said, his voice like steel. "The truth is out, and I will no longer allow such baseless rumors to stain the name of someone who is, by all accounts, a woman of integrity and honor." Ophelia, her heart still racing, could hardly believe what she was hearing. The Duke had not just defended her, he had exposed the truth in front of all of London's most influential figures. And, in doing so, he had turned the tables completely. He had shattered the false narrative that had so viciously been crafted around her. But as the ball erupted into a flurry of conversation, Ophelia could not shake the feeling of vulnerability that washed over her. Her heart swelled with gratitude for the Duke's actions, but she was torn. This public defense, this act of chivalry, would have consequences. The Duke was a man of immense stature, and his association with her, especially after such a public spectacle, would undoubtedly make his life more difficult. She could see the subtle glances from the assembly, the raised brows, the whispers of disbelief. How could a man of his power, wealth, and title stand by a woman like her, one without fortune, one without a dowry? Ophelia caught the Duke's eye again. His expression had softened, and there was something in the way he looked at her, something deeper than just the defense of her honor. But what did it mean? Did he truly care for her, or was this all an act of nobility, a gesture made out of some sense of duty to a woman in need? The doubts gnawed at her, and though the relief of having her name cleared washed over her, Ophelia felt an aching uncertainty linger in her chest. She had never been the kind of woman to seek attention, much less the attention of a man like the Duke. And now, as the Duke stood before her, his quiet strength and unwavering support clear for all to see, Ophelia was left to wonder, was this just a fleeting moment of gallantry, or was there something more? Her thoughts were interrupted by the Duke's approach. He stepped toward her, his expression softening as he reached out and took her hand in his. "Ophelia," he said quietly, his voice full of sincerity, "I meant what I said. This was not about my title or wealth. This is about you." Ophelia's heart skipped a beat as she looked up into his eyes, searching for any trace of falsehood. But in that moment, she saw only the truth. and in that moment, she realized that everything had changed. The days that followed the Duke's public defense of Ophelia were a blur of uncertainty and quiet wonder. Despite the initial wave of relief, the weight of the scandal still lingered in the air, pressing down on both Ophelia and the Duke. The whispers had not ceased. If anything, they had only grown louder. But amidst the noise, something genuine had begun to take root between them, a connection that neither could ignore. Ophelia, though still bearing the sting of public scrutiny, found herself increasingly drawn to the Duke. He had not just defended her honor, he had shown her a kindness that felt, for the first time in her life, utterly sincere. His actions had not been born of duty or pity, as she had feared, but of something deeper, something that could not be easily explained. The Duke of Ravensdale was a man of intelligence, of refinement, and as their meetings continued, Ophelia found herself enchanted by his depth of thought and his keen sense of curiosity. They began to meet regularly, in quiet corners of London's finest libraries or in private rooms at his estate, where they would discuss matters of literature, philosophy, and the ideas that shaped their world. What had begun as an accidental meeting at the ball had evolved into a friendship grounded in shared intellectual pursuits. At first, their conversations had been polite, measured, the kind of discussions one might expect between two people from different social spheres. But as the days passed, Ophelia began to notice the subtle shift in the dynamic between them. The Duke was no longer just a figure of distant authority. He had become a person, someone whose opinions Ophelia valued, whose insights made her think in ways she had never considered before. One afternoon, after a particularly engaging conversation about the works of Shakespeare, Ophelia found herself lingering at the door to the Duke's study. She hesitated before stepping inside, a small part of her afraid that by entering his world, she would somehow betray the fragile connection they had formed. But when the Duke turned from his desk and smiled at her, she felt an unexpected warmth flood her chest. "Miss Green," he said with a glimmer of amusement in his eyes, "I was beginning to think you had forgotten our agreement. You were to tell me your thoughts on Hamlet." Ophelia's heart fluttered in her chest at the sound of her name on his lips. It was the first time he had said it so casually, as if they were equals in this space, rather than the Duke and the penniless daughter of a clergyman. For a moment, the outside world, her family's judgment, the scandal that clung to her name faded into the background. "I haven't forgotten," she replied softly, moving toward the chair opposite his. "In fact, I've been considering the play quite a bit. Hamlet's indecision, it's a reflection of the world he finds himself in, and I think there's something tragic about it, something universal." The Duke's eyes sparkled with interest as she spoke, his posture leaning forward as though eager to hear more. "And what is it that you find tragic about him?" he asked. Ophelia's thoughts flowed freely, no longer constrained by self-doubt or the weight of society's expectations. She spoke of the way Hamlet's inaction mirrored the paralysis she often felt in her own life, the way his hesitations mirrored her own struggles with identity and purpose. She spoke with an honesty she had rarely afforded herself, and as she did, she realized that for the first time in a long while, she was no longer just performing for the world around her. With the Duke, she could be herself, unfiltered, unafraid. Their conversations, which had once been centered around books and ideas, soon began to drift into more personal territory. They began to share their thoughts and dreams, their past regrets, their hopes for the future. Ophelia found herself confiding in him more than she had ever intended, speaking about her mother's cold indifference, her father's shame, and the way she had been made to feel invisible by the very people who should have loved her most. The Duke, too, began to open up in ways Ophelia had not expected. Beneath his poised exterior, there was a vulnerability that he rarely allowed others to see. He spoke of his childhood, of the loneliness he had often felt growing up in the shadow of his family's expectations, the burden of his title weighing heavily on his shoulders. He admitted, with surprising humility, that he had never truly felt at home in the world of the aristocracy, that he had always longed for something more genuine, more real. Ophelia listened intently, her heart swelling with empathy, as she realized how much they had in common. They were both, in their own ways, bound by the expectations of their respective worlds. He, the Duke, bound by the weight of his lineage and the unspoken pressures of his position, and she, the daughter of a once proud family, shackled by the expectations of her birth and her lack of fortune. As the days passed, Ophelia found herself thinking more and more about the Duke, not just as the man who had defended her honor, but as someone she could trust, someone who had come to understand her in a way no one ever had before. The walls she had so carefully built around her heart, walls forged by years of ridicule and rejection, began to crumble, piece by piece, with every shared moment and every heartfelt conversation. But even as her feelings for the Duke deepened, a part of her hesitated. She had always believed that she was destined to be alone, unwanted, unloved. Her family had made it clear that she was a failure, a burden to be hidden away. The Duke's interest in her, his kindness, his attention felt like something too precious to trust, too beautiful to be real. She had seen how quickly society turned on those they deemed unworthy, and she couldn't help but wonder if the Duke's affection for her would fade once the scandal had subsided, once the whispers had died down. Ophelia's heart ached with the weight of this fear, and in those quiet moments when she was alone with her thoughts, she often found herself retreating back into the safety of doubt. Could the Duke truly care for someone like her, someone who had nothing to offer but a broken name and a tarnished reputation? Meanwhile, the Duke of Ravensdale struggled with his own emotions. Though his growing affection for Ophelia was undeniable, it was not without its complications. He had spent his entire life adhering to the expectations of the aristocracy, fulfilling his duties as a duke, and living a life dictated by titles and wealth. Yet, in Ophelia, he found something completely different, something that defied the very rules he had lived by. The more time he spent with her, the more he found himself questioning the world he had been born into. Ophelia's intelligence, her honesty, her quiet dignity, these were the qualities that drew him to her, not her status, not her fortune. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. He wanted to be with her, to build something real and meaningful. But there was a catch. Ophelia did not come from his world. She did not belong to his circle of wealth and privilege, and that fact loomed over him like a heavy cloud. Alexander found himself torn between the woman he had come to care for deeply and the duty he had to his title, his family, and his society. His position in the aristocracy had been shaped by generations of tradition, and though he longed to break free from the constraints of that world, he knew the consequences of such a decision. Marrying Ophelia, an impoverished woman with no dowry and no connections, would not only cause a scandal but could potentially destroy his reputation and his place in the world. The battle inside him was fierce. His heart told him to follow his feelings for Ophelia, to cast aside the expectations that had always governed his life. But his mind, conditioned by years of societal pressures, whispered that he should remain within the safety of his world, choosing a wife from the circles he had always known. As the bond between him and Ophelia grew stronger, Alexander found himself more and more conflicted. He cared for her deeply, perhaps more than he had ever cared for anyone, but could he truly risk everything for a woman who, in the eyes of society, was considered nothing more than a social pariah? Ophelia, for her part, continued to battle her own demons, unsure of whether the Duke's affection was real or simply born of a desire to right the wrongs of the scandal. But as their connection deepened, she began to realize that the Duke, too, was struggling caught between the love he had found and the world he had been born into. The journey ahead, though filled with uncertainty and doubt, would ultimately force both of them to confront not only their fears, but the very world that had shaped them. Would their growing bond be strong enough to overcome the barriers that society had built between them, or would they be torn apart by the weight of expectation and convention? The days after the Duke's defense of Ophelia were filled with a strange, tense calm. London's whispers had not ceased, but they had quieted to a low murmur, as if everyone was waiting for the next move, the next scandal, the next declaration. Ophelia was no longer the invisible daughter of the Green family. She was now a figure of public interest, a topic of heated conversation in every drawing room. Some spoke of her with disdain, others with a kind of reluctant admiration, but none of them truly understood the connection she had with the Duke. None of them saw what she saw, the quiet intensity in his eyes, the gentleness in his touch, the way his presence seemed to bring a measure of peace to her turbulent heart. Their meetings, though frequent, had remained mostly intellectual, the discussions about philosophy and literature still providing the backbone of their interactions. But Ophelia had begun to feel something more growing between them. The chemistry, once subtle and unspoken, was now undeniable. It was one afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the library at Ravensdale House, that Alexander Fitzhugh, Duke of Ravensdale, decided to make his intentions known. Ophelia was seated by the window, her attention divided between the book in her lap and the view of the sprawling estate beyond. She had been lost in her thoughts when she heard the door creak open behind her. She turned, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the Duke standing in the doorway, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "Miss Green," he began, his voice low and steady, "there is something I must speak with you about." Ophelia's breath caught in her throat. The formal tone, the way he had used her full name, it was unlike any conversation they had ever had before. She placed the book aside and stood up, her hands slightly trembling. "Of course, Your Grace," she replied, her voice betraying the anxiety that had suddenly settled in her chest. Alexander stepped forward, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made Ophelia's heart race. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he paused, as though searching for the right words. For a long moment, the two of them simply stood there, the weight of unspoken emotions hanging in the air between them. Ophelia could feel the gravity of the moment, the stillness of it. Her mind raced, wondering what he was about to say. "I have spent much time thinking," the Duke said finally, his voice steady but tinged with an emotion Ophelia had not expected. "Thinking about you, Miss Green, about everything we've shared, the conversations, the understanding. I have come to a decision, one that will undoubtedly surprise you." Ophelia's pulse quickened, her mind struggling to keep pace with her emotions. She knew what was coming, knew that he would finally say the words that had been hanging in the air between them since that first dance at the charity ball. The moment they had shared, the connection that had grown between them, had led to this moment. But still, she could not shake the gnawing uncertainty that clung to her. "Ophelia," the Duke continued, taking a step closer to her, "I do not offer you this because of duty or pity. I do not offer you a life of wealth or a marriage of convenience, as so many would expect. I offer you my heart, and with it, a life that is not based on titles or social standings, but on something more important, on something genuine." Ophelia's breath caught in her throat. She looked up at him, wide-eyed, her heart hammering in her chest. Had she heard him correctly? Could this truly be happening? Alexander took another step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. He reached into the pocket of his coat and, to Ophelia's shock, pulled out a ring, a simple yet elegant band, its stone glimmering in the fading light. He held it out to her. "I ask for your hand in marriage, Ophelia," he said, his voice firm but filled with vulnerability. "Not because of your wealth, not because of your status, but because I care for you in a way that transcends all of that. You have shown me what it means to live a life of integrity, of authenticity. I want to share that life with you. Will you marry me?" Ophelia's heart raced as she stared at the Duke, at the ring he held in his hand, at the sincerity in his eyes. She wanted to say yes, wanted to let herself be swept away by the tenderness of his words, the warmth of his offer. But there was a part of her, a small but insistent voice inside her, that couldn't help but hesitate. "Are you certain?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Are you certain this is what you want? To marry a woman like me?" Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Alexander said nothing. He stepped closer, closing the space between them, and placed a gentle hand on her cheek. "I am more certain of this than I have ever been of anything in my life," he replied softly. "I do not care what society thinks, Ophelia. I care only for what is real between us. I want to build a life with you, not as a duke and his bride, but as two people who have found something worth fighting for." Ophelia felt a rush of emotion overwhelm her, but doubt lingered in her heart. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the Duke of Ravensdale, the most eligible bachelor in England, could truly love someone like her, someone without wealth, without status, someone whose reputation had been tarnished by scandal. "I don't understand," Ophelia whispered, the vulnerability in her voice clear. "You've offered me your heart, but what of your reputation? What of the Duke of Ravensdale? What will society say?" Alexander's expression softened as he cupped her face in his hands. "Let them say what they will," he said, his tone unwavering. "I have spent my life adhering to society's expectations, Ophelia, and look where it has gotten me: lonely, detached, and empty. But you have made me see what I've been missing. I choose you, Ophelia. I choose this life, our life, and I will not let anything or anyone stand in the way of that." Ophelia felt the tears that had been threatening to fall finally spill over, but this time they were not tears of fear or confusion. They were tears of relief, of understanding. She had always believed that she was unworthy of love, that her family's scorn and society's judgment had defined her. But in that moment, standing before the Duke of Ravensdale, Ophelia realized something that had eluded her for so long. She was worthy. She was worthy of love, of connection, and of a future that didn't depend on the opinions of others. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." The Duke's face broke into a smile, and he gently slid the ring onto her finger, his touch warm and tender. The world around them seemed to fade, and for a brief moment it was just the two of them, no whispers, no judgment, no expectations. But as Ophelia looked down at the ring on her finger, reality began to set in. This proposal, this life with the Duke, would come at a cost. They would both face the scorn of society, the ridicule of the ton. Her family would never approve, and London's elite would never understand. Ophelia's heart fluttered with both excitement and fear. She had always known that her life would be defined by the world's judgment. But now, standing with the Duke, she realized that she didn't have to accept that fate. She had a choice that would change everything. The whispers had already begun, but this time, Ophelia no longer feared them. She had found something far more powerful than society's approval. She had found love, and that was worth more than any title or wealth. But the road ahead would not be easy. Society would never let them forget their difference in station, and her family's disdain would follow them wherever they went. Yet, as she looked up at the Duke, Ophelia knew that they could face whatever came their way, as long as they had each other. And for the first time in her life, Ophelia believed in the future, one built not on society's expectations, but on the love they had found in each other. The days leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of activity, and Ophelia found herself caught in a tidal wave of emotions. The news of her engagement to the Duke of Ravensdale had spread like wildfire through London, and as the wedding day approached, the weight of it all began to settle on her shoulders. The woman who had once been invisible, overlooked, and dismissed, now stood on the cusp of becoming the wife of one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England. She was no longer the useless daughter of a broken family, destined to fade into obscurity. No, this was something entirely different. Ophelia was about to marry a duke, a man who had chosen her not for her fortune or her family's status, but for who she was. The very thought sent a shiver through her spine. The preparations had been grand and overwhelming. The best dressmakers in London had been commissioned to create the perfect gown for her. She had been measured and fitted, her gown stitched together with delicate lace and soft ivory silk materials, far more luxurious than anything Ophelia had ever imagined wearing. The gown was beautiful, but it was also a stark reminder of how much had changed in her life in such a short span of time. She had been thrust into a world of wealth and opulence, a world that had once seemed as distant as a dream. The castle-like estates, the grand parties, the endless invitations, everything about the Duke's life seemed foreign to Ophelia, yet it was now hers too, by virtue of the love that had grown between them. But with all the beauty and grandeur came a gnawing sense of doubt, one that she could not entirely shake. As much as she had come to love the Duke Alexander, as she now thought of him privately, there was still the lingering thought at the back of her mind that her life, and the life she was about to share with him, could never be truly simple. They were both products of a society that placed an unfair value on wealth, power, and titles, and even though she had proven her worth in the eyes of the Duke, she knew that the rest of the world would never fully understand or accept her. The night before the wedding, Ophelia found herself alone in the room she had been given at Ravensdale House. The vastness of the space seemed to echo the enormity of the changes in her life. She stared out the window at the full moon, its pale light illuminating the garden below, and for a moment she allowed herself to reflect on how far she had come. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had stood in the cold shadows of London's ballrooms, humiliated and dismissed by her own family, mocked by society. She had been taught to believe she was worthless, that her lack of a dowry and connections defined her place in the world. It was a lie she had been forced to accept until she met the Duke. Now, standing on the precipice of a new life, Ophelia could hardly believe how much had changed. She was about to marry a man who had fought for her, who had seen her for who she truly was, not as a woman defined by her social standing, but as someone worthy of love, respect, and happiness. She thought back to the moments they had shared, the first dance at Lady Asprey's ball, the quiet conversations in the library, the way Alexander had opened himself to her in ways no one else had ever dared. He had chosen her, not for any reason other than that he had seen something in her that no one else had ever seen. He had given her the one thing she had longed for, the chance to be loved for who she was, not for what she could provide or what she had been born into. Ophelia's chest tightened with emotion. She was no longer the invisible daughter of a fallen family. She was the woman about to marry a duke, a man who had changed her life and shown her that her worth did not lie in wealth or status, but in the strength of her character. As the evening wore on, Ophelia made her way to her small sitting room, a place she had taken refuge in over the past few days. Her thoughts were a jumble of excitement and anxiety, and the reality of what lay ahead seemed too large for her to fully comprehend. Tomorrow, she would be a bride, not just a woman in a gown, but the wife of the Duke of Ravensdale, the woman who would stand by his side, facing the world as a united front. But even as her heart soared with happiness, doubt lingered. She had grown accustomed to the whispers, the judgment, the eyes that looked at her as though she were a curiosity, an outsider in a world that could never truly accept her. Even now, as the clock ticked closer to the wedding hour, Ophelia wondered if she was ready for all of it. She had come so far from the girl who had once been afraid to dream, but she still carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Could she truly belong to this world of wealth and titles, of aristocratic expectations? Could she be the wife of a man like Alexander? And if so, would she ever truly feel like she was enough? The next morning arrived with a brilliance Ophelia had never known. The sunlight poured through the windows, bathing the room in a soft, golden light. The house bustled with activity maids preparing her, the scent of fresh flowers filling the air, and a palpable sense of anticipation. Ophelia's heart raced as she was dressed in the gown that had been created for her, her mother's heirloom lace carefully arranged at the neckline. The fabric felt heavy, as though it was a tangible representation of the weight of what was about to happen. She stood before the mirror, her reflection staring back at her, still unsure of what she saw. The woman in the mirror was beautiful, yes, but she was also unfamiliar. This wasn't the Ophelia who had spent years in the shadows of society's expectations, nor the one who had walked into Lady Asprey's ballroom with her heart in her throat. This was a woman who was about to become part of something larger, something she could not yet fully grasp. Ophelia took a deep breath and closed her eyes, pushing aside the fear that lingered in the corners of her mind. This was her moment. This was her life. She was no longer the girl who had been taught to believe she was nothing. She had become the woman who had defied society, who had been chosen, loved, and cherished by a man who had seen her for who she truly was. When she reached the church, the grand stone edifice seemed to close in on her, its towering spires reaching for the sky, as though trying to hold her in its embrace. Inside, the pews were lined with flowers, the air filled with the soft murmur of hushed voices and the rustling of silk gowns. The congregation stood in silence as Ophelia made her way to the altar, the aisle before her as wide as the gulf she had crossed in her life. She glanced up to see the Duke standing there, waiting for her, his expression softened by an emotion Ophelia could not place. His tall figure seemed to fill the space, commanding yet gentle, his eyes fixed on her as if she were the only person in the room. As she reached him, her heart fluttered, and for the first time in her life, she felt certain of one thing. She had found her place. Not because of the title she would soon bear, or the wealth she would come to share, but because she was standing beside the man who had chosen her, loved her, and seen her for who she truly was. The ceremony unfolded around them, a blur of vows, prayers, and promises. When the moment came, the Duke of Ravensdale took her hand and spoke words that seemed to echo through the centuries. His voice, deep and steady, rang with sincerity as he vowed to cherish her for the rest of his life. "I, Alexander Fitzhugh, take you, Ophelia Green, to be my wife," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Not for what you can offer, not for what the world expects of us, but because I love you, and I will love you as long as I draw breath." The vows were deeply personal, a declaration of love that transcended everything they had fought against. They were not just words spoken in front of a congregation. They were the binding of two souls, two people who had learned to see each other as equals in a world that had never allowed them to be. When the bishop pronounced them husband and wife, the church rang with the sound of applause, not just from the high-born guests, but from the truth of the moment. This marriage was not the culmination of duty or tradition. It was a victory of love over wealth, of authenticity over expectation. Ophelia's heart swelled with joy, and as the Duke kissed her gently, the world outside seemed to fade away. In that moment, they were no longer bound by the expectations of society. They were simply two people, bound together by something far stronger than titles or wealth, by love. And as they stepped out into the sunlight, hand in hand, the future ahead of them seemed as bright and limitless as the sky itself. Ophelia stood by the window, watching as the last rays of the afternoon sun bathed the garden in golden light. Ravensdale House, with its sprawling grounds and grand architecture, was now her home, hers and Alexander's. It was a home not built on the expectations of titles or fortune, but on the quiet strength of their bond. The Duke of Ravensdale had long ceased to be a distant figure of nobility to her. He had become Alexander, her husband, her partner in a life they were building together, piece by piece. The first weeks of their marriage had been a whirlwind, filled with new experiences and quiet moments of discovery. For Ophelia, every day was an unfolding revelation. The man who had once seemed so distant, so wrapped in the weight of his title and duties, had revealed to her a depth of emotion and a kind of gentleness that no one had ever expected. And she, too, had come to know herself in ways she never thought possible. Their life together, though simple compared to the grandeur of London society, had been rich in ways that Ophelia had only dreamed of. They spent their days reading together in the library, long walks through the gardens discussing books and philosophy, or sitting side by side in the drawing room, lost in their own worlds but always sharing the same space, the same quiet understanding. Ophelia's family had not approved of her marriage. Her mother's letters were filled with barely concealed disdain, and her father's terse words still echoed in her mind. But none of that mattered anymore. She had left that world behind when she walked down the aisle, and now she was free to live her life in the way she had always wished, with the man who had chosen her for exactly who she was. "You seem lost in thought." Alexander's voice broke through her reverie, warm and rich, like the sunlight streaming into the room. Ophelia turned to see him standing in the doorway, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "What's on your mind?" Ophelia smiled back, her heart light in a way it had never been before. "Just thinking how much has changed," she said softly, "and how much we've already built together. I never imagined that I could find a place like this." Alexander crossed the room, his presence a steadying force. He reached for her hand, and as he pulled her toward him, Ophelia felt the familiar warmth of his embrace. It was the simplest of moments, yet it filled her heart with a kind of peace she had never known before. "Everything has changed, hasn't it?" Alexander murmured, his fingers brushing her hair back from her face. "For both of us. But it's a good change, Ophelia. A change I've never looked for, never expected, but that I wouldn't trade for anything." Ophelia looked up at him, her chest swelling with emotion. "I've always felt like I didn't belong, that I was nothing more than a burden to my family, a disappointment. But with you here, now I feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Alexander's eyes softened, and he cupped her face gently in his hands. "You were never a burden, Ophelia. You were always worth far more than they ever saw. And he paused, searching her eyes, "I've never been happier than I am right now, standing here with you." Ophelia's heart swelled, and she leaned into his touch, letting the weight of his words sink in. For the first time in her life, she felt as though she truly mattered. The man she loved, the man who had seen her for exactly who she was, had chosen her not for what she could offer, but for what she brought to his life, the way she had made him see the world differently. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, their relationship only grew stronger. They carved out a life together that was far from perfect, but it was perfect for them. They didn't need the trappings of wealth or the approval of society to validate their love. They had each other, and that was enough. Their marriage became a sanctuary from the world, a place where they could be themselves without fear of judgment or expectation. They entertained rarely, choosing instead to spend their time in private, enjoying the simple pleasures of life. They would host small gatherings with close friends, where conversation flowed easily and laughter echoed through the halls of Ravensdale House. But for the most part, Ophelia and Alexander were content to live a quiet life, away from the scrutiny of the ton. Ophelia began to immerse herself in causes she had always cared about, particularly those related to the welfare of women and children. She worked alongside the local community, helping those who had been overlooked and discarded by society, just as she once had been. Alexander supported her efforts fully, often accompanying her on visits to the people she helped. He saw the passion in her eyes when she spoke about the work she did, and he admired her even more for it. For Ophelia, this was her way of giving back not just to the world, but to herself. She had spent so many years living in the shadow of her family's disdain, believing she had no worth. But now, with Alexander by her side, she had found her place in the world, a place where her value wasn't determined by her wealth or lineage, but by the work she did and the love she shared. Alexander, too, found himself changing in ways he had not expected. When they had first met, he had been consumed by the expectations of his title, the weight of his family's legacy pressing down on him. But with Ophelia, he had found a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. She had shown him a different way of living, one that didn't depend on the approval of others, but on the authenticity of their connection. The two of them, despite their differences in background, had become a team. They supported each other's dreams, they challenged each other to grow, and they found joy in the quiet moments they shared. Their love, built on respect and mutual admiration, was a foundation strong enough to withstand whatever life threw their way. And as the years went by, their bond only deepened. Ophelia no longer saw herself as the useless daughter of a fallen family. She was Ophelia Fitzhugh, the Duchess of Ravensdale, but more importantly, she was a woman who had fought for the life she wanted, a life based on love and integrity. She had overcome the limitations society had placed on her, and with Alexander by her side, she knew that together they could face anything the world had to offer. Their legacy was not one of wealth or titles, but of something far more enduring: love. Their story became one of defiance against the shallow expectations of society, a testament to the power of genuine connection. They had built a life together not based on outward appearances or the judgments of others, but on the strength of their love for one another. It was a love that had transcended all barriers, proving that when two people truly see each other for who they are, nothing else matters. As Ophelia and Alexander stood together on the balcony of Ravensdale House, looking out over the vast expanse of land that now felt like home, they knew they had created something special, something that would last far beyond their time, a love story that would be told for generations to come. And as they stood there, hand in hand, looking out over their future, Ophelia realized that the journey they had begun together was only just beginning. Their love, built on mutual respect, understanding, and the simple joy of each other's company, was the greatest treasure they had ever known. Together, they had built a life of their own, a life that was theirs alone, free from the expectations of the past, and full of the promise of a future filled with love. Ophelia and Alexander's love story shows us that true connection, built on trust, integrity, and love, is stronger than any societal expectations. Their journey is a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures lie in the people we choose to love. If you enjoyed their story, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe love can defy societal norms? What part of their journey touched your heart the most? Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an exciting new story of love, passion, and transformation. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to bring you along for the next adventure.